passion, the same love. I hope you are building friendships and relationships and prospects of collaboration. Now, we have an amazingly gifted cohort of Yale Divinity School student workers and Princeton Theological Seminary student workers who run this program. And one of our new students this year is an amazing worship leader, composer of anthems, choral works, etc. And she's going to lead us in a bit of worship today and offer a grace over our mural. Would you welcome to our YMI, Barrett Getz.
Good afternoon. My name is Barrett, and I just want to invite you to kick off our time together with some musical worship. We don't worship because we have to. We don't worship because it's traditional. We worship because we love God, and we want to invite God to be with us in this time. So we're going to sing a song called Peace in Our Hearts, and the song testifies to two things. The first one is that you do not need linguistic complexity to communicate something theologically complex, right? So my church back home, it's a bilingual church, so we have folks that are in different stages of learning the English language. We want to give our youth something substantive, but not something that's inaccessible. And the second thing that this song testifies to is that when we come before the Lord in worship, we come with our whole bodies. We come with our whole selves, and you don't have to be a great singer or an instrument player to worship. We're actually not going to use instruments in our worship this morning. We're going to create some music with our bodies and with our voices. So as you are able, would you stand with me? And I'm going to teach this song to you. What we're going to do first is get the rhythm going. Then I'm going to teach the melody to this section of the room, the middle section. Then we're going to add in a middle harmony to this section of the room. Hey guys, this section. And lastly, we're going to add in the low harmony over here. Sound good? All right. So the rhythm goes like this. Stomp, stomp, snap. Would you join with me? All right. Middle section, are you ready to sing the melody with me? Peace, peace in our hands, peace in our hearts, peace from our God. Peace, peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our hands, peace from our God. Peace, peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our hands, peace from our God. Peace, peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our hands, peace from our God. Peace, peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our hands, peace from our God. Peace, peace, peace in our hearts, peace in our hands, peace from our God. Sing to me about joy, joy, joy in our hearts, joy in our hands, joy from our God. Joy, joy, joy in our hearts, joy in our hands, joy from our God. Sing to me about love, love, love in our hearts, love in our hands, love from our God. Love, love, love in our hearts, love in our hands, love from our God. One more time, sing it loud. Love, love in our hearts, love in our hands, love from our God. Sing it out loud. Love, love in our hearts, love in our hands, love from our God. Amen.
All right, thank you, Barrett. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonah Heiser. I'm the program coordinator at the Yale Youth Ministry Institute and a second-year Master of Divinity student here. It's really wonderful to see you all here today. It's always good to be in this space with you, and it's good to see a lot of familiar, friendly faces, and it's always great to see a lot of new faces. So, welcome to everybody here today. We're all here because we care about young people. We care about their flourishing, and we know that they are not only the future of our church, but they are an integral part of our present. We're here because we want to learn more about how to serve them, and we want to grow ourselves so that we can serve them better. And this lecture today, I think, is really going to help us do that. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to draw some attention to some of the handouts on your table. With this, we have this little trifold brochure is our programming for this semester. It lists our lectures, the one in October, the one today, and our last one in December. It also has our website and some of the information about our social media sites. So please check us out on our website. Please check us out on social media. We have, every week we do postings, little kernels of content, little interview clips just to spread some more knowledge, spread some more of our materials with you, and that way you can stay up to date on everything that we're doing. We also have this brochure, this flyer for next month's lecture. It's going to be a really phenomenal lecture from Miroslav Volf, along with Paul Gorell, and on forgiveness and joy. So please put that on your calendars. We also have this survey from the Lifelong Learning program here at Yale. We would love to get your feedback on this. So if you have time, please fill it out and return it to our registration table before leaving today. All right. So our speakers today, David Anderson Hooker has over 30 years of experience facilitating peacemaking from a variety of different perspectives and positions. He earned his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College, a Master of Public Health, and a Master of Public Administration from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, a JD from the Emory University School of Law, a Master of Divinity from the Candler School of Theology at Emory, and a PhD in Social Construction from the University of Tilburg. He has served as the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Georgia. He's had his own private civil rights practice. He's an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And he has worked with communities, governments, nonprofit organizations, and international NGOs in countries as diverse as Bosnia, Croatia, Cuba, Myanmar, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Southern Sudan, and Somaliland. Dr. Hooker is currently the professor of the practice of conflict transformation and peace building at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. His primary areas of expertise are post-conflict community building, multi-party conflict transformation, multi-generational trauma, and reconciliation around conflicts related to race, class, and other socially constructed variables. With him is Dr. Elizabeth Khoury. She is a professor at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in the practice of youth education and peace building. She received her bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary, her Master of Divinity from Candler School of Theology, and her PhD from Emory. She currently teaches classes in religious education, youth ministry, peace studies, and practical theology. Along with that, she is also the director of the Youth Theological Initiative at Candler, where she runs an intensive residential summer program for high school students interested in learning more about theology and the relation between faith and civil engagement. So please join me in a warm welcome of these speakers.
Thank you. I'm really great to be here. David is very intentional about sharing power, so he wanted to make sure that you heard from me first before I turn it over to him, and then I'll be speaking later. But we're both very delighted to be here. Thank you.
In the name of the Creator, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, redeeming and just, beneficent and merciful. By my very presence, I bear witness that there is but one God. Good morning. All protocols acknowledged and observed. I do want to thank the staff and the youth ministry program for inviting us, for having us here, and even after having talked to us last night and heard that, there may be a kind of a slither of heathen in each of us, still allowed us to show up this morning, and so I'm grateful for that. I don't get to Connecticut as often as I used to. I studied at UMass in Amherst. And while I was at UMass in Amherst, every other Sunday I would come down to New Britain, Connecticut, where my father's eldest brother, my Uncle Willie James, lived. And my Uncle Willie James was an AME pastor with a 3-point charge. And so he had a church in New Britain and a church in New London, and then there was someplace in between that he had a church. And on the Saturday nights, I would come down and we would get up and we would leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning to drive to the furthest church where he would preach, we would have breakfast, and sometimes he'd have to have a trustee meeting. And then I would drive him. He always took a nap. He always slept because he would preach a different sermon when he got to the second church. And we would have lunch, and then we would drive to the third church. And in my second and third year, what my Uncle Willie James decided was that I have a decent capacity to speak to young people. And so at each church when we showed up, when I was there, I would have to give the youth sermon, the little, all the children come to me, you sit down here, and I have something to say. And he would tell me what the scripture was that I was going to be talking about on the drive to that particular church. He says, I think that today the youth want to hear about. And so that was my first exposure to youth ministry. I was ruined to youth ministry from early on and decided it's something I will never do. Right? And so I realized that there is a lot more intentionality. People who do it really, really well. And I was ruined to it long before I was called to the ministry. So, I thank my Uncle Willie James. In the sacred scriptures, in the Gospel of Jesus according to Luke, in the 10th chapter, beginning at or about the 25th verse, there is a passage which says, "Then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he said, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' Jesus said to him, 'What is written in the law? What do you read there?' And he answered, 'You shall love the Lord with all your God and all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind.'" Holistically love the Lord and love your neighbor as yourself. He said to him, "You've given the right answer. Do this and you'll live." So the lawyer poses this question: what must I do to inherit eternal life? How must I live in a way that experiences God's joy, God's favor, and or the good life in alignment with the will of God? The first question that Jesus poses in response is actually a question about the lawyer's hermeneutic. He says, he assumes he's a lawyer. He assumes he's read the scripture. He understands the scripture. So the question is about his hermeneutic. How do you read it? What do you make it mean? Right? And so this is actually like a really, really important aspect of our being, is to understand our hermeneutic. I'm not in youth ministry technically. I'm at a college now, and before that I was at another college, faith-informed, faith-focused, Eastern Mennonite University, and now at the University of Notre Dame, where it is understood, it is expected that some aspect of your teaching at Eastern Mennonite would conform with the statement of faith the confessions of faith in the Mennonite perspective, or at Notre Dame, the Catholic social teachings, right? And so it's important, there's an expectation of a hermeneutic, but I tell the students when I get them that the most important thing is to understand the narrative. What are the narratives that shape your identity, that cause you to perform in a particular way in the world? Like what are the narratives that shape your performative being in the world? And the reason that this is so important is because the same skill sets, the exact same skill sets that are used to be peace builders can be used to be colonizers. And it's only your intention, it's only your understanding of how you show up in the world that will make a difference as to who you're going to be. We've seen the same sets of scriptures that can be used to support and justify enslavement and diminishing and excluding. We're witnessing it now in any number of denominations using scriptural texts and interpretations as a way of excluding. Those same texts, depending on your hermeneutic, can create a space of inclusion, a beloved community, a loving space, a table where everybody has equal place. It depends on your hermeneutic. And so we have to help in the formation of hermeneutic. First disclaimer, I'm a lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer, I should say. And yet I believe everybody deserves a good defense, and so while the author of the Luke text questions the motives of the lawyer who stands up to ask the question, I actually think that it's a legitimate question: what must I do to be saved? And I think Jesus affirms the significance of the question by at least asking him or engaging him in a conversation. What is it that you read there? Now we know the rest, that's the beginning, and the rest of it's about the Samaritan story, not the Good Samaritan story, right? Right? I apologize, I'm ordained in the black church tradition. And so often when I ask a question, I'm actually inviting, even though this is a lecture, I apologize, even though this is a lecture, it's not the Good Samaritan. The text says it's a certain Samaritan. When we call it a Good Samaritan, we're continuing to put forth the kind of understanding, the slight of Samaritans. We're saying some of them might be good. The same way you might hear somebody say that smart woman, the well-spoken Negro. You might as well put Negro behind it if you're going to say well-spoken, right? It's that kind of slight. It's not the Good Samaritan, it's the Samaritan story. So what is it but that's not where that's a digression, I apologize. So the question is, what must we do? And the rest of the paragraph, the parable tries to describe, in some ways how you might act. But what happens is these youth, in the context that I operate in, youth arrive on campus and they actually they possess the goodwill. They have an intention to live out the two primary commandments, the first and the second commandment, to love God, love your neighbor. They have great love for God. They're not sure how to go about this whole loving your neighbor thing. Like, how do you do it? The first challenge is many of them have come out of congregations whose theology is aligned with societal narratives of the other, which create them as other, with a hierarchy, often with certain others not being either lovable or even those considered to share the same sense of humanity. And so they're challenged by that. But even if they want to move away from those theologies, how do they actually do it? And so we remind them in peace and justice studies, we remind them what Dr. West says, which is that justice is what love looks like in public. But when they arrive and they don't have either the analytical capacity or the skill set to actually do this thing where they love their neighbor, I'm actually saddened because I think for most of them it was a missed opportunity for their home church. I actually blame the church that they come out of. If they were in a congregation for 6, 10, 12 years, and they don't arrive at the university in the first part of their practicing of adulting with an analytical skill set or a capacity, an analytical framework or a skill set to actually do loving your neighbor, to do justice, that was a missed opportunity. And so we should spend time talking about what that missed opportunity, how we might overcome that missed opportunity, right? And so when I was invited to do this, and I was talking, I talked to two of the people who I know the best, who have done this work really well for a long time, Beth Corrie and Dr. Itihari Toure, who can't be with us. She's having some health challenges. We're praying for her. But when we sat and we were just trying to chopping it up at Panera, and we were trying to think of how do we think about this? What's the issue? We arrived at 3 points, which these are the 3 points, is that a vital aspect of youth development, faith formation, is empowering young people, with a faith-informed, community-focused critical consciousness. Critical consciousness by itself is helpful. Critical consciousness that is community-focused is significant. We have the responsibility to ground it in the narratives of our faith. And so development that incorporates a faith-informed, community-focused critical consciousness is essential to the work of the church. And then we say that we agreed that young people are formed in community and that joy cannot be fully experienced except communally and in pursuit of just peace. And finally, we acknowledge that the church has significant opportunities to intervene at critical junctions in youth formation to help them see the importance of pursuing communal just peace for their own ability and to live God's good life. And you all know that, which is why you're here. You know that you have the opportunity to intervene. You know that these faith formation and identity is formed in community, that community is designed both for joy and for justice, and that sending them out with a faith-informed, community-focused critical consciousness is essential. And so how do we do that? I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the high school that I went to, Walnut Hills High School, was a public school, but it was a magnet school. It was a college prep magnet school. And so the way that you get into Walnut Hills is everybody in a certain realm, a certain distance from the school, all of the districts take a test. And the top 3% of test takers are invited to come to the school. It turns out that one of my best friends from elementary school was a young man, we're same age, and he had been wheelchair bound since I knew him, since like preschool, I guess. And so when it was justice have become sanctified social clubs with merely a thin veneer of religiosity. There are as many congregations that qualify under that as not. And so our work, when we have them, even in the midst of AP Calculus and soccer and band practice and Jack and Jill and all of the other distractions, when we have them over time to build practices and ideation and identity focused in a critical consciousness. Freire talks about this critical consciousness as the ability to analyze, navigate, and challenge oppressive social forces shaping one's life and one's community. We have to be able to notice both how it oppresses, how we're being oppressed, and how others are being oppressed. And it's often really important because it's Richard Rohr, who says that we know when we are oppressed, but we often fail to recognize when we're being the oppressor. James Baldwin would help us think about this a slightly different way. James Baldwin says that the paradox of a critical consciousness and education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which they are being educated. Which means that if we are teaching a critical consciousness, it's very possible that the first place the youth will critique are the systems, the structures, and the resources in the church. And so we have to do what we call narrative alignment. Your values have to show up in the congregation in the same way that you're projecting outside. And so we have to teach a critical consciousness, and that critical consciousness includes several capacities: the capacity to reflect on power dynamics, to read literature from the perspective of the oppressed. Christianity was formed at the margins. We live in kind of this triumphalist Christian context, which doesn't often allow us to see and interpret Christianity from the margins. Our hermeneutic has to be from the margins. How do we practice that? Some of what Dr. IT would talk about, some of the ways that Beth helps us think through this and practice it will help us to think about that. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is identity formation. The reason we're working on identity formation and not doing critical consciousness, justice seeking, the acclaim, the acquisition of joy is in the being, not in the doing or the having. We most often teach our youth to do so that they can have, so that they can be. Study hard, be successful, have a good life. I think that that reverses it. The idea is you're being first. Seek ye first the realm of God and all of its righteousness, identifying the right relationships in the realm, because when you do that, that tells you, in right relationship, that tells you how you should act in any given moment. So our work is about identity formation, and the way that we test to determine whether critical consciousness has been established or is being established is we create these identities. And I can talk more and more about all of this, but these identities have to be relationally constructed. We exist in relationship to one another. Our identity is shaped by one another. They have to be authentic, coming from a healed place and not from a hurt place. They have to be dignified, which means that it allows there's space in the institution for all of our being to be present, not for just parts of it to show up, right? Interconnected, affirming, legitimated, which means it's in the practices and policies. It's not just by whim, and then we test it by being performatively co-equal. What I would have said is, and so Dr. IT is going to talk about how this happens in community, how these one practice that she is very familiar with that helps to form these relationally constructed radical identities in community. She's not here, so let me just share a couple of thoughts from her component. She grew up in LA, and she was part of or her family was connected to a fairly progressive, even radical social movement. And in that movement, they had a set of rituals that were used at every stage of life, at birth, at the passage, rites of passage from adolescence into adultness, at the adult stage like marriage or whatever, and even at the passing of a loved one, the transition into the ancestral age. They used this, and the ritual was it was both informed by the developmental psychologists who talk about the need for consistent value infusion in every aspect of life, and by African theology and African psychology that brings in a space for the trickster and the kind of griot, the teacher and the one who will challenge you, because all of our values are experienced and really learned at crossroads. And so everything is a crossroad. And we understand this because it gets formed, our identities and how we should be and what we should choose gets formed in community at crossroads. Imagine Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. At a crossroad, I can shirk or I can resist. I can continue to live this life, or I can shrink away from the challenge, and it's in the values that are formed in community that this emerges. And so the practice that she has developed that has been implemented in communities, multiple communities now, but in her communities since the 70s. And so children have been raised in it, grandchildren have been raised in it, great-grandchildren are now infused in this set of practices, which is this 8-bowl ritual. The way that the ritual works is the person who is at the center of the focus of the ritual tastes from each bowl. And as they're tasting from each bowl, the wine, the honey, the lime, the salt, the chilies, the water, the palm oil, the coconut. There is an elder or a griot that is teaching the central value and principles that are attached to that. And then after they have tasted and learned from each bowl, then the rest of the community tastes from each bowl as a way of affirming those values. And you do this at every stage, every major transition point in life, to continue to infuse those values in our way of being, so that we can know what to do at every crossroad that we reach. And so she could talk a lot more about it. I can describe it a little more in our question and answer period. But what we want to know is 3 things. We want to say that there is an essential need for a critical consciousness to be constructed. A lot of times, or in all cases, that critical consciousness and identity is informed in community, and it turns out that church and houses of faith have the opportunity to intervene at various points in the development of a person's life, and particularly in youth formation. And I want to invite Beth to talk a bit about how that has worked for her.
Okay, this is on working okay? Great. Thanks. So I'm going to give you a little fun. I was helping my mom pack up her house to move down closer to me, and found this photo of myself from 1986. And I actually took a picture of it and posted it on Facebook and said, jokingly, should I return to this fashion? And of course, actually, a lot of people were like, absolutely, you should return to this fashion. But I'm going to tell a little story about this group. And so I always have a lot of sympathy for the youth that are kind of trying to straddle a couple of different worlds. So that's me in 1986, thereabouts. That man over there is the Reverend Larry Clark, and he was the district youth leader in the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. So I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, another Ohioan, other side of the lake, and went to this very tiny local Methodist church. So it was literally me and my sister and 2 other sets of siblings who were in this youth group. And my mom would do what she could. But her real gift as a youth pastor was driving us to the district youth events and conference youth events. Do I have any Methodists in the house? We're not really in Methodist territory, but if you belong to a denomination that has, a structure where you have like a presbytery or a synod, you can appreciate how useful this is. So like in full connectionalism, our little band of Methodist youth would go to these district activities, and that's where the real formation happened. And as it happened, Larry Clark was in charge of youth at that time. Larry Clark was a white man married to an African-American woman, and someone who was deeply committed to racial justice and to peace building. And he actually used what he had within his own church structure to teach us some very radical ideas. So I always tell the story, I was a cradle Methodist. So when I'm around folks that can sort of tell you when they became Christian, I can't do that. But I can tell you the day I became committed to social justice. I was converted to social justice within the church, but I was always in the church. When I was converted to social justice around this time at the Peace with Justice Youth Retreat at Lakeside Camp on the shores of Lake Erie. And so what happened was our leaders led us in a simulation game. It's 1985, 86 when this happened. A simulation game in which they took different parts of our group, or imagine sort of like 100 youth, it's the whole district, and a small minority of us were given a certain set of privileges and freedoms to walk around the whole room. A much larger percentage of us were packed in a really tight part of the room and not allowed to go out. And there were some other youth that could kind of go in and out but had other restrictions on their movement. And we weren't really sure why this was happening or what was going on. Structures under apartheid South Africa, the privileges that the whites have, the restrictions that the blacks have, and then the coloreds and the different ways that those racial privileges were doled out in order to control the whole society. I was 14, and I remember that moment to this day thinking, there's something really unjust happening in the world. I got 5 minutes? Oh, darn it. Something really unjust happening in the world, and I am called to do something about it. So very quickly, because I got 5 minutes, I'm going to come back to Larry in a second, but that picture was in 2006, so this is the 80s. 30 years later, this man is still advocating, as a collar on, this one was advocating for raising the minimum wage in Toledo, Ohio. Right, so he's still at it, and so am I. I'm the director of the Youth Theological Initiative, and one of the things that we do, based of that experience, it's one of the things I've been working at and through at YT, is a particular simulation game we call the Game of Life. And in this game, I have staff of about 15 people who are playing different roles of basically bureaucrats, cops, judge, pastor of a prosperity gospel church. And each of the youth are given name tags just like this with different codes and a different amount of money. And those codes, the color of the name tag, gives you their socioeconomic class, and then some of them additionally have other codes. I stands for immigrant, some of them are coded as persons of color, some are coded as LGBT, some are disabled. But they don't know what that stands for, and they have to move through this game and the only thing they're told is to put on the label, take their money, and go live life. And of course, the first thing they do, because these are 16-year-olds, is they rush to the education office, because they're very well trained to know that they must have an education. But they get to the education office, and they're like, well, it costs X amount of money to get this degree. And of course, some people have the money right away, and some people don't. And so the people who don't realize, oh, I guess I got to go get a job. So they go to the employment office. Well, at the employment office, depending on the label, you're counseled in certain career paths. So if you're high class, but coded as a person of color, you're strongly considered to become a professional athlete, right? But if you're an immigrant, all the forms you're given are in gibberish, and the person talks to you really, really loud and slowly. And there's all kinds of microaggressions that are happening. And they're moving around. As I said, there's a prosperity gospel church in which they're essentially trying to get you to tithe as much as possible. And they love the more upper class people, even if they're minorities, so they can have them as tokens. But if they're LGBT, then they're sort of insinuating that they need to be prayed over. But all of this is done subtly enough that usually the youth don't get what the codes mean at first. They just know they're being treated differently, and they can't quite figure it out. And so they run through this game for about 30 minutes, and that is all it takes before they start to truly embody that unjust system that we've created. And so some, they're cycling in and out of the prison. Every time they go through the justice system, they get a new sticker on their label, which means they get discriminated even further when they try to get a job or get housing. I call payday about every 5 or 10 minutes so that then the people with stuff get more and more and more, and the wealth inequality grows more and more. The staff who usually play the police officers get really into the job, and they tend to be corrupt, and they do good cop, bad cop, and they super harass the people that are coded as poor or minorities, and they're super, super nice and obsequious to the people who are coded as white and as high class. And so it's interesting to watch, because at some point around the 35-minute mark, you start to get things like jailbreaks or protests, but if you keep letting it go, they run out of steam with the protests. So, because we don't have a lot of time, I can't go into more detail maybe in the Q&A, but the point is that we do that as the first of many things in which we teach them about intersectionality and structural oppression. And I use some theological language using Walter Wink, who's a liberation theologian who talks about the principalities and powers, use that Pauline language of principalities and powers to talk about the structural level of sin, that sin is not just, personally not cheating or stealing or hurting people, but that you are part of a system that creates harm in your name and on your behalf, whether you realize it or not. And this game makes it very clear. And what things that always happen is the ones who have the most amount of privilege are just completely focused on going from station to make more money and get jobs, and they actually literally no longer see the people right next to them that are suffering. And once they realize that in the debrief, they're like, oh, now I get it. Now I get why my privilege or someone else's privilege shields them from seeing how other people are being harmed. They start to see all of the tiny ways in which the system is resilient, that even when you try to resist it, it can co-opt you again and again. And so we use that to start off over a 3-week program to then send them out into Atlanta and look at sex trafficking and study poverty and homelessness and study racial injustice and have them to start to see in real life, okay, these are how the structures of oppression work. These are the tiny, subtle ways that people are treated differently, that people are harmed in these tiny ways that we cut them off or make them invisible or ignore their suffering. And so they start to get this concept. And yeah, again, we're running out of time, so I'll say more in Q&A if you'd like. But what I wanted to then suggest to you is, so YTI, and there's brochures on your table that you can look at. It's a 3-week program for high school students. They come from all over the world to come to this. You can send your youth to this. But it still only reaches a small number of youth. And I didn't have a YTI when I was growing up. I had district youth conference leader, but I happened to have a pretty fantastic, creative, resourceful youth leader who took something from our own denomination and then ran with it and did radical things under the cover of it. So the United Methodist Church has what's called Peace with Justice Sunday, and that's what he used to kind of justify bringing a bunch of kids on retreat to teach them about intersectionality. We didn't have that word then, but he taught me what that concept was, this idea that you can have a very complex web of power and privilege and oppression. And so sort of my call to you, which we can talk about more, though, is that how can you take some of the stuff that that are developed in these intensive youth programs like YTI and bring them back to your local congregational level. I think that simulation games like this are really important in raising awareness, to see their little minds moving and seeing it for themselves. And I should say, I just did this on Monday with my Candler Masters of Divinity students. And a few of them had a little bit more justice language to help them navigate it, but mostly they all fell into the same trap. They all kind of ended up doing the same thing. And so even older young people can benefit from this sort of consciousness-raising activity. So I think I'll stop here.
I want to thank David and Beth for a wonderful presentation, and we know we have to keep covenant with you for those who need to get to work or to home or to class. So we're going to take just a short break. Please, I can see we got more of the mousse, we got more of the carrot cake, we got more coffee and drinks. Help yourself. We're going to return for Q&A in about 3 minutes. Would you join me in thanking our speakers today? All right, my brothers and sisters, I hope you have re-upped at the Moose Bar, or the Carrot Cake Bar, or the Coffee Bar. We do have some time. We had so many amazing ideas presented. We have some time to invite our speakers to unpack them or to respond to particular questions you have, either of their perspective, their scholarship, or the ways in which they would do it on the ground in a local church. So one thing I want to remind you is that because we have a live stream audience that runs to 115 countries around the world, they can't hear your question unless you're speaking it into a microphone. So if you'll raise your hand if you have a question, we'll always bring you the mic. Who has a question?
Yes, thank you. I'm fascinated by the game that you designed. It's inspirational, actually. And my question to you is, what type of people did you include? You mentioned a few, but did you include bad guys as well? Did you include bad guys in society, in your game society?
Did I include bad guys in the game? Is that your question? Well, really, all of the staff who are playing the different roles of the bureaucrats play the role of the bad guy. Well, they're playing a role in which they're instructed to treat everyone in different ways, specifically connected to the what's on their label. And so when we finish the game, we actually do have the staff reflect on what it was like to basically be a jerk, while the youth are also reflecting on the experience of being discriminated against. And that's also very telling, because they'll say, like, I started off being really uncomfortable, being mean to certain of you, and then I realized how easy it became, easier and easier. And even, like, I usually have two people play the role of the cops, and they can kind of be good cop, bad cop. But, you know, for instance, I had a man who's white, grew up in rural Georgia. His father had lots of friends who were police officers, and he was scarily good at being a very racist cop. And what he said was, it's just like the longer I was acting the role, the easier it became to do the role, because I knew what it was. I grew up with it, I saw it, I knew what they said, I knew what they did, and it just kicked in. And so we talk about, like, the evil of the system, that the system itself takes perfectly good people and encourages them to do bad things. So they're not bad people, there are good people doing bad things in the midst of a very bad system. And that's also part of the lesson, is that when you're in a deformed, unjust system, which we are, people are put in roles that are very difficult to get out of that role, and that you have to be critically conscious about the way just simply your role as a bureaucrat with a certain level of power is easy to abuse. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Who else has a question for our speakers today?
In either the game or the consciousness development from the earlier part, have you ever experienced participants in that having any epiphanies about white privilege, or does that have to be introduced explicitly and then wrestled with?
Yeah, it's pretty. They pretty quickly get it, because also part of the debrief is that they have to add up their net worth. They're grouped by class, by socioeconomic class, and they have to add up their net worth. But what happens is that there'll be, say there's 8 with the gold badge, which is like the 1%ers.
there'll be one that's also coded as an immigrant and one that's coded as a person of color, and they'll already be in just calculating the net worth differences. And so part of the process is then why is that? And they have to start listing all the behaviors that they experience, and they start realizing, oh, I didn't have that, or oh, that's interesting, or I saw that happen. And then when we reveal, oh, you know, P stands for person of color, they're like, oh. So it actually doesn't take, I mean, these are 16 and 17-year-olds. So they're not unfamiliar with some of these terms, but they get it in a new way because they're like, they'll say, what'll happen is they'll say, but it's not really like that, is it? And the other people in the room are like, oh yeah, it is. And part of what makes it so powerful is YTI itself is a very diverse community, so we would have people telling stories about, that's not made up, this really happened to me, and having other students be able to hear that and say, oh, okay. Yeah.
I think it's also in part of the relationally constructed aspect of building a critical consciousness. You look at, so one of our activities includes just making a list, a long laundry list of why are people poor. And we do a long, long list of why are people poor. Perfect. And now, after you've made your exhaustive list of why people are poor, we put columns over it. And so then we put, you know, W, H, A, O, like which of these reasons for people's poor applies to white, Hispanic or Latino, Asian, African, African American, like that. Like, and so then you start noticing, okay, this doesn't, it kind of, you know, and so you'll start to notice the ways in which the rules and the narratives that have informed the way that we imagine the world to work aren't necessarily always applying, and then we'll back up and notice, like, what are the systems and structures that underlie these narratives, or even sometimes refute the narratives that we are operating in. And that helps them to unveil, and it's not really just whiteness as privilege. I mean, there are a number of different ways in which privilege is manifest, and so we want them to notice all of them, right? And to notice the things that they do ultimately that allow the sustaining, like what are the ways that you perform and show up in the world that may be how you navigate to get around it so you can be successful, but in your success around it, you're affirming it, or you're reaffirming the reality of that thing, which is an important part of critical consciousness. It's not just about unveiling and being aware and navigation, but it's also about the resistance and the deconstruction of those different systems. So absolutely.
Thank you. Other questions? Who'd like to pose a question? Going once. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to our guests, Beth Khoury and Dr. David Anderson Hooker, Dr. Corrie. Next month, first Wednesday of December, Miroslav Volf, one of the premier theologians of our time, on a question that I know I've been reading him on forgiveness for 20 years, long reflection on how this relates to joy and the experience of adolescence. So thank you for coming today. See you again next month.